You really think you can just waltz in here and ask for a call sign, old man? The voice was sharp, dripping with a cocky arrogance that only youth and inexperience could provide. Lieutenant Ryan Davis stood there, arms crossed, blocking the entrance to the command center. His eyes scanned the elderly man, Captain James Dragon 6 Miller, who stood calmly in front of him. Davis couldn't hide the smirk that tugged at his lips. To him, the old veteran was nothing more than a relic. So, tell me, Grandpa, what's your call sign? I'm sure it's something real cute, right? Captain Miller didn't flinch. He simply adjusted the collar of his worn jacket and glanced at the young officer with eyes that had seen more than Davis could imagine. My call sign, Miller said slowly, his voice steady and calm, is Dragon 6. There was a pause, a flicker of disbelief in Davis's eyes. The room seemed to hold its breath for a moment. Davis laughed. Dragon 6? Really? What? Did you make that up yourself, Grandpa? I'm sure it's got some cool story behind it, right? The other officers in the room began to murmur, exchanging looks of amusement. They were used to seeing veterans like Miller around the base, but none had ever been bold enough to step into the heart of the command center without proper clearance. Miller, however, wasn't fazed. He had fought battles that Davis couldn't even begin to comprehend. The air around them seemed to grow heavier as Davis's mockery continued. You must have been some kind of hero back in the day, huh? The kind of hero who spends his time cleaning up after the real soldiers. Miller's gaze didn't waver. Instead, his eyes seemed to look right through Davis, into a distant past where this young officer's words didn't matter. And just as Davis was about to add more fuel to the fire, the door to the command center swung open. A stern voice interrupted the tension. Lieutenant, that's enough. The commanding officer, Colonel Harrison, stepped into the room, his presence immediately silencing the room. Captain Miller, he said with a nod of respect. Davis froze. He hadn't expected this. He didn't know who this man was or what he had done, but the shift in the room was palpable. The officers around him suddenly stood a little straighter. This is a private area, Davis started, still trying to assert himself. And this man, he gestured toward Miller, I know exactly who he is. Colonel Harrison cut him off. The tone in his voice was cold and authoritative, the kind that left no room for argument. You're lucky he's even here, Lieutenant. You'll show some respect. Davis's smug grin faded. His confidence shattered like glass. The colonel turned to Miller and extended his hand. It's an honor, sir, he said. The room was silent now, the earlier laughter replaced by a quiet reverence. Davis's face turned pale as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. The man he had mocked was not just some old veteran. He was a living legend. And now, Davis had to live with the consequences of underestimating him. The room was still, as though time itself had paused in the wake of the colonel's sudden intervention. Lieutenant Davis stood frozen, his mouth open, but no words came out. His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. The man he had mocked, the old veteran standing before him, was someone far beyond what Davis could have ever imagined. The respect that Colonel Harrison had just shown him was palpable, and it left Davis with a sinking feeling in his stomach. He had messed up badly. Captain Miller didn't seem to notice the tension in the air. He didn't need to. His presence, calm and unwavering, was enough to command the room. He turned to Colonel Harrison, who stood still with a look of quiet reverence. It's been a long time, Miller said, his voice low, but carrying a weight that echoed in the silence. I wasn't expecting to be here today. Colonel Harrison gave a nod, his eyes softening just a fraction. We all have our roles to play, Captain. Miller let out a faint, knowing smile. He had heard that line more times than he cared to count, but this time, it felt different. The weight of history hung in the air. The room was filled with military officers, young and old, each one processing the shift in power that had just taken place. Davis, still unable to fully comprehend the situation, watched as Colonel Harrison turned toward him. Lieutenant, the colonel's voice was firm, like a stone crashing into water. You'll remember this moment. This is why we show respect. This is why we don't judge based on appearances. Davis swallowed hard, his face flushing with embarrassment. The lesson was clear. He had failed to recognize the man before him. And now, the entire room could see the price of his arrogance. Yes, sir, Davis mumbled, his voice barely audible. He felt the eyes of every officer in the room on him. The shame was almost suffocating. Meanwhile, Miller simply turned back to Colonel Harrison, who was already gesturing to the nearby desk. "Let's get to it," Colonel Harrison said. The conversation shifted to business, but the underlying current of respect and awe lingered in the air. Miller, the man with the call sign Dragon 6, was no longer just a legend from the past. He was someone who commanded the highest regard. The room had seen it. Davis had learned it the hard way. And for Miller, it was just another day in a life that had been shaped by countless moments like this one. The young officers and soldiers in the room would never forget the lesson they had witnessed. Respect wasn't earned by rank. It was earned by actions, by a lifetime of dedication, and by the humility to stand tall even when the world didn't recognize you. As the conversation continued, Davis remained silent, his thoughts a whirlwind of regret and newfound respect. He had witnessed something extraordinary today, and he knew he would never look at another veteran the same way again. It was an awkward silence that filled the room after the exchange between Captain Miller and Lieutenant Davis. The air was thick with the unspoken truth of what had just happened. Davis, still trying to piece together the reality of the situation, stood rooted to the spot, his face pale. His mind was running in circles, trying to understand how he had misjudged a man who was clearly not just another elderly veteran, but a living legend. He could feel the weight of his mistake pressing down on him, each passing second a reminder of his arrogance. Captain Miller, on the other hand, remained unfazed. His composure was a stark contrast to Davis's inner turmoil. He had lived through far worse than the mockery of an overconfident young officer. In fact, he had spent most of his life being underestimated. But today, in this room, the world had shifted. The respect he commanded was no longer whispered. In the shadows of military history, it was here, visible for all to see. Colonel Harrison, aware of the tension that still lingered in the air, broke the silence. "Lieutenant, you'll be briefed on the next assignment later," he said, his voice firm, but not unkind. "Captain Miller, please join me in the conference room." As they walked down the hallway, Davis stood frozen in place, his thoughts scattered. His eyes followed them, watching as Miller walked beside the colonel with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime walking through the halls of power. Davis felt small, insignificant in that moment, a mere bystander to a history he couldn't even begin to comprehend. Inside the conference room, the mood was different. It was professional, but the atmosphere had shifted. The younger officers who had been in the command center now looked at Miller with new eyes. They had witnessed the power of his presence. As the conversation about the upcoming mission began, Davis couldn't help but feel out of place. He was no longer the confident officer who had mocked the veteran. He was the one who had been exposed, shown up for what he truly was, naive and disrespectful. As Captain Miller spoke with the colonel, his voice steady and commanding, Davis realized that he was hearing the words of a man who had seen the world in ways that Davis could only imagine. There was no boast in Miller's tone, no attempt to elevate himself. He simply shared what was needed, and every word carried the weight of experience. At that moment, Davis understood something he hadn't before. It wasn't just about the medals, the call signs, or the glory. It was about the quiet strength that came from years of service, of sacrifice, and of loyalty. Captain Miller wasn't a relic of the past. He was a living testament to everything the military stood for. As the meeting concluded, Davis stood by the door, unsure of what to say or do. But as Miller walked past him, there was a brief moment when their eyes met. Davis opened his mouth to speak, to apologize for his earlier words, but no words came. Instead, Miller simply nodded, acknowledging the young officer's silent realization. The lesson had been learned. The respect had been earned. And the room, once filled with tension, was now filled with something else, an understanding. That would stay with Davis for the rest of his career. The next few days passed in a blur for Lieutenant Davis. He couldn't shake the image of Captain Miller's calm demeanor and the quiet authority that had radiated from him. Every time Davis closed his eyes, he saw the veteran's unwavering presence, the way he had commanded respect without raising his voice or even trying. He found himself replaying the events in his head over and over, each time with a sense of deeper realization. The young officer had thought he knew what it meant to serve, to be part of something bigger than himself. But in those few moments, Captain Miller had shown him what true service was. It wasn't about the medals, the accolades, or the glory. It was about humility, sacrifice, and the quiet understanding that you did your duty because it was your responsibility, not because of the recognition. Davis had spent years in the military, but until that day, he hadn't truly grasped what it meant to be a soldier. He had been so focused on the rank, the achievements, and the outward symbols of success that he had missed the heart of it all. Now he understood. The lessons Captain Miller had unknowingly taught him were profound. Respect wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned through your actions, through the quiet moments that spoke louder than any title ever could. Over the next few days, Davis worked harder than he ever had before. He threw himself into his duties, but this time with a new sense of purpose. He wasn't trying to prove himself to anyone. He was trying to become the kind of officer that Captain Miller would respect. The colonel had called him into his office a couple of days after the incident in the command center. Davis, nervous but determined, stood before him, awaiting his evaluation. The colonel didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Lieutenant," he began, his tone as steady as ever. "I've been watching you closely over the past few days. You've stepped up in ways I hadn't expected." Davis's heart pounded in his chest. "Sir, the colonel held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not here to listen to excuses, Lieutenant. I'm here to tell you that you've earned a second chance. A second chance to prove what kind of officer you're going to be." Davis swallowed hard, the weight of the colonel's words sinking in. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." "I know you won't," the colonel replied with a small nod. "Just remember, respect isn't given, it's earned. And it's earned by those who show others what they stand for, not by those who boast about it." Davis nodded, taking those words to heart. He left the colonel's office with a renewed sense of determination. He didn't need to be the best. He didn't need to be the loudest. He just needed to be someone who did his job with integrity, humility, and respect for those around him. That afternoon, he found himself back in the command center, going over the new mission brief. He noticed Captain Miller sitting in the corner, his eyes focused on the task at hand. This time, Davis didn't feel the need to mock, to challenge, or to question. Instead, he simply nodded at the veteran. Miller looked up and returned the gesture, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made Davis feel, for the first time, like he had been accepted. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Days passed, and Lieutenant Davis found himself walking a new path, one paved with lessons learned and the weight of respect that had been unexpectedly thrust upon him. Every morning, as he put on his uniform and stood before the mirror, he reminded himself of the promise he had made, not just to Colonel Harrison, but to himself. He was going to be the officer he knew he could be, the officer Captain Miller had shown him could be possible. It was subtle at first, the changes in Davis. They weren't loud or dramatic, but they were there. He started paying more attention to the little things, the way his fellow officers spoke to one another, the way they carried themselves. He noticed the respect they gave each other, the way they listened when someone spoke, and how they acted without needing to boast about their own achievements. Davis adopted that same demeanor, a quiet strength that didn't need to demand attention, but commanded it nonetheless. One afternoon, during a debriefing session, Davis found himself sitting across from Captain Miller once again. This time, there was no hesitation, no cocky attitude or mockery in his eyes. He simply sat and listened. Miller, as always, was focused on the task at hand, his voice steady and calm as he provided valuable insights into the mission. Davis nodded along, taking mental notes, absorbing the wisdom that seemed to come so naturally to the older man. The respect was mutual now, unspoken but understood. After the meeting, as everyone filed out of the room, Davis found himself walking beside Miller. For the first time, there was no awkward silence. They walked in step, both of them focused on the mission ahead. "Captain," Davis said, his voice quieter than usual but filled with sincerity, "I just wanted to say thank you. For everything. I've learned a lot." Miller glanced at him, his eyes thoughtful. He gave a small nod. "I'm just doing my job, Lieutenant," he replied. "But if you're learning, then I've done something right." Davis couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in those words, simple as they were. In that moment, he knew that Captain Miller wasn't just a veteran who had earned the respect of everyone around him. He was a man who had spent his life teaching others, without ever needing to say much. And Davis, now more than ever, felt like he was becoming the kind of officer Miller could be proud of. The next morning, as they prepared for the next mission, Davis stood alongside Miller once more, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He had learned not just from the mission briefs or the tactical plans, but from the quiet dignity that Miller exuded every day. And as they marched forward, Davis knew that he was no longer the young officer who had mocked the veteran. He was now part of something greater, something built on respect, honor, and a commitment to serve. He didn't need a call sign or a title to know that he was now worthy of the lessons he had learned. The journey was far from over, but Davis was no longer walking it alone. He had found his place, not just in the military, but in the respect and legacy of those who had come before him. Weeks had passed since Lieutenant Davis had begun to change, and the shift in his demeanor had not gone unnoticed. The respect he had for Captain Miller had grown, and with it, his commitment to becoming a better officer. He no longer looked for ways to prove himself in the eyes of others. Instead, he sought to prove something to himself. Every day, he worked harder, listened more, and put others first. The other officers, especially the younger ones, started to notice the difference. They began to seek his advice, not out of obligation, but because they respected him. Davis had earned their trust, just as Miller had earned his. One evening, after a long day of training exercises, Davis found himself sitting in the mess hall, reflecting on how far he had come. He had always been the one to rush through meals, eager to get back to the next task, the next challenge. But now, with a newfound appreciation for the simple moments, he took his time. He noticed the other veterans in the room, most of them much older than he, and he wondered how many of them had faced the same challenges, the same struggles, the same doubts that he had. It was then that Miller walked in, his usual quiet presence filling the room. He made his way over to Davis's table and sat down without saying a word, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Davis looked up, offering a smile. "I was just thinking about how much has changed," he said, his voice sincere. Miller nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "You've come a long way, Lieutenant. You've learned what many never do." Davis raised an eyebrow, unsure if he should ask. "What's that?" he inquired. Miller leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant, as if recalling memories from a time long past. "The true meaning of service," he replied quietly. "It's not about rank, not about glory. It's about showing up every day, doing the job because it needs to be done, and doing it with honor." Davis absorbed his words, the truth of them settling deep within him. It wasn't just about being good at his job. It was about doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. It was about loyalty, integrity, and, above all, respect. For the first time, Davis felt the weight of the uniform in a way that went beyond duty. It felt like a promise. After that evening, things seemed different. The bond between Davis and Miller deepened, not because they talked about it, but because it was felt in the unspoken moments. In every task, every conversation, and every decision, Davis carried with him the lessons he had learned. He no longer saw himself as someone trying to prove himself. He saw himself as part of something much larger than his own ambitions. As time went on, the officers around him began to respect him not just for his position, but for the person he had become. They saw in him the quiet strength that Miller had always exemplified. He had become the kind of leader he once admired, and in doing so, he found a new sense of purpose. One day, as Davis stood in the command center reviewing mission details, Miller walked past him, giving a small nod of approval. It wasn't much, but to Davis, it meant everything. He had earned the respect of the man he admired most. And in that moment, he realized that the journey wasn't about recognition. It was about growth, about becoming the best version of himself, not for anyone else, but for him. Weeks turned into months, and Lieutenant Davis found himself becoming someone he had never imagined he would be, a leader, not by title, but by action. It wasn't the flashy recognition or the quick promotions that defined his journey, but the quiet moments that shaped him into the officer he had always aspired to be. The respect he had for Captain Miller continued to grow, and with it, the understanding that true leadership wasn't about exerting power over others. It was about lifting them up. Davis had learned the importance of service, of commitment, of showing up each day, ready to face whatever challenges came his way. He no longer looked at his rank as a measure of his worth. It was the actions behind the title that truly mattered. On a particularly quiet afternoon, Davis was sitting in the command center, reviewing reports and organizing the team's upcoming assignments. He had just finished a call with another base when the door opened, and in walked Captain Miller. The veteran's presence always seemed to fill the room in a way that was impossible to ignore. There was nothing loud or showy about it. It was just the calm confidence of someone who had been through it all and still remained grounded. Miller gave him a nod as he walked toward the table. "Got a minute?" Miller asked. Davis looked up and smiled. "Of course, Captain. What's on your mind?" Miller took a seat across from him, his gaze thoughtful. "I've been watching you, Lieutenant," he began, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of something deeper. "You've come a long way since that day in the command center. I've seen a lot of officers, a lot of soldiers, but it's rare to see someone with your drive and humility." Davis blinked, surprised by the compliment. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." Miller leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in his lap. "Don't let it go to your head," he said with a small smile. "You've got a long way to go, but I have no doubt you're going to be a hell of an officer." Davis felt a surge of pride, but he kept it in check. He had learned not to let praise distract him. "I'm just trying to do the job," he said. "One day at a time." Miller nodded. "That's the right mindset. But don't forget that it's not just about the work. It's about the people you lead. You've got a good team, and they're looking up to you. Lead them well, and they'll follow you anywhere." The words resonated with Davis. He had always focused on the mission, on getting things done. But Miller's words reminded him that leadership was just as much about the people as it was about the objectives. The mission was only successful if the team was successful. And success, he realized, didn't come from pushing people to do more. It came from supporting them, from helping them find their own strength. As the conversation continued, Davis felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just serving under Captain Miller anymore. He was becoming the kind of officer Miller had always been, a quiet, steady leader who commanded respect through his actions. The days of proving himself to others were behind him. It was now about proving something to himself, about becoming the best version of the officer he could be. And with every day that passed, he knew he was getting closer to that goal. As Miller stood to leave, he turned to Davis one last time. "You've got this, Lieutenant. Don't ever forget why you're here." Davis watched as Miller walked out, the weight of his words settling deep within him. The journey was far from over, but he was no longer the officer who had once doubted himself. He was becoming the leader he had always hoped to be. The weeks that followed only reinforced Lieutenant Davis's resolve to be the officer he had promised himself he would become. He began to step up in ways he had never imagined, gaining the trust and respect of his fellow officers without ever needing to raise his voice or flaunt his achievements. He had learned that true leadership was about integrity and consistency, not about showing off or trying to stand out. His new approach to service was subtle, but it was making an impact. Every day, Davis showed up with the quiet strength that Captain Miller had demonstrated time and time again. Whether it was helping a fellow officer with a tough assignment or stepping in to defuse a tense situation, Davis was no longer the young, brash officer who had once thought he had all the answers. He was now the one others turned to for guidance, and he took that responsibility seriously. It wasn't long before Colonel Harrison began to notice the change. During a routine briefing, the colonel pulled Davis aside, away from the group, his expression unreadable. "Lieutenant," he began, "I've been watching you, and I have to say, I'm impressed with the progress you've made." Davis's heart raced as the colonel continued. "You've stepped into a leadership role without anyone needing to tell you. You've earned the respect of your peers. You're not just doing your job, you're setting an example for others to follow." Davis stood still, the weight of the words sinking in. He had always respected Colonel Harrison, and hearing praise from him meant more than he could express. "Thank you, sir. I'm just doing my part," Davis replied, trying to keep his composure. The colonel nodded, giving him a small but genuine smile. "You're doing more than that, Lieutenant. You're becoming the officer we need. Keep this up, and you'll be in a position to lead this entire unit one day." Davis's mind raced as the colonel walked away. The thought of leading a unit someday seemed distant, almost surreal, but the words of his commanding officer planted a seed in his mind. It wasn't just about surviving in the military anymore. It was about becoming someone who could inspire others. That night, after the briefing, Davis found himself reflecting on everything that had led him to this point. He thought about the times he had stumbled, the mistakes he had made, and how each one had taught him something valuable. But most of all, he thought about Captain Miller, the man who had shown him what true leadership looked like. The next morning, as Davis prepared for another day, He looked at his reflection in the mirror with a new sense of purpose. It wasn't about the title or the rank. It was about being someone others could rely on, someone who would never stop striving to be better. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. And as the days went on, Davis continued to serve with quiet dignity, knowing that he was exactly where he needed to be, serving not just for himself, but for the team, for the mission, and for the legacy of those who had come before him. Months passed, and Lieutenant Davis found himself more settled into his role than ever before. The respect he had earned from his peers continued to grow, and so did his own sense of self-worth. He had transformed, not just in how others saw him, but in how he saw himself. Gone were the days of seeking recognition for every accomplishment. Now, he was focused solely on the work and the people he led. He began to realize that the true measure of success wasn't about accolades or promotions, but about making a real difference. Captain Miller's words echoed in his mind constantly. Leadership was about service, not titles. One afternoon, as Davis reviewed the new mission brief in the command center, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. He looked up to see Colonel Harrison entering the room. The colonel walked straight toward him, a look of determination in his eyes. "Lieutenant," he began, his voice steady, "there's been a shift in assignments. We're going to need you to step up." Davis's heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting a simple update, not this. "What do you need, sir?" he asked, trying to mask the nerves that suddenly arose in his chest. The colonel paused, placing a set of documents on the table in front of Davis. "We're looking at a new strategic operation, and I've recommended you for the lead officer role." Davis stared at the papers, trying to process the weight of the responsibility being placed on him. It wasn't just another assignment. This was a pivotal moment, a chance to truly prove what he had learned. "I won't let you down, sir," Davis said, his voice firm, the commitment clear in his tone. Harrison nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Davis. "I know you won't," he said simply. "You've earned this position. But remember, this isn't about you. It's about the team. Lead them the right way, and we'll succeed." Davis sat back in his chair, the gravity of the situation sinking in. This was the moment he had been working toward without even realizing it. For so long, he had been focused on improving himself. Now, it was time to focus on something bigger than himself, his team. As he prepared for the upcoming mission, Davis reflected on everything that had led him here. He thought about the struggles, the mistakes, and the moments of doubt. But more than anything, he thought about Captain Miller, the man who had shown him what real leadership looked like. The older officer hadn't just been a mentor in the traditional sense. He had shown Davis that leadership wasn't about demanding respect. It was about earning it through actions, through consistency, and through the quiet moments of dedication that others often overlooked. That was the kind of leader Davis wanted to be. As the mission approached, Davis found himself standing at the forefront, surrounded by his team. They looked to him now, not as the young officer who had once been uncertain, but as the leader they could rely on. He wasn't perfect, but he was ready, and that was enough. The operation went off without a hitch, but the real victory was in how Davis led. He was no longer the brash, untested officer he had been when he first joined. He was a leader, the kind who inspired others not through words, but through actions. And as the mission wrapped up, Davis couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. He had earned it, and he had earned it the right way. Lieutenant Davis stood on the observation deck of the base, staring out over the horizon. The mission had been a success, and the sense of accomplishment was still fresh, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind. The weight of responsibility had shifted again. For the first time, Davis realized that leadership wasn't just about completing one task. It was about sustaining that success, about making the right decisions day after day, and making sure that those you led could follow you through the toughest challenges. He had come a long way from the officer who had mocked Captain Miller all those months ago, but now that he was in charge of something bigger, he felt the pressure. The responsibility was heavier than any rank or call sign he could ever wear. As he turned to leave the deck, his mind was filled with the faces of the men and women who had worked alongside him, trusted him, and relied on his guidance. It wasn't just about his leadership skills anymore. It was about them. They were his team, and every decision he made affected them. Back in his office, Davis sat at his desk, sorting through paperwork, when the door opened, and in walked Captain Miller. Davis immediately stood up, instinctively straightening his uniform. Miller, as always, was calm and collected, a quiet force that filled the room. "How's everything going, Lieutenant?" Miller asked, his voice steady. Davis gestured to the paperwork in front of him. "It's been good. The team performed well, and we're moving forward with the next phase. But I can't help but feel like I'm missing something." Miller nodded, as if he had anticipated the sentiment. He took a seat across from Davis, his eyes thoughtful. "What do you feel is missing?" Davis leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. "I'm not sure. It just feels like there's more to this than just getting the job done. I'm responsible for these people now. What if I make the wrong decision?" Miller smiled, a small, understanding smile. "Lieutenant, you've already shown that you have what it takes. Leadership is never about being perfect. It's about being willing to learn, to make mistakes, and to keep moving forward. As long as you're committed to the people you lead, they'll follow you." Davis absorbed the words, feeling the weight of them sink in. "It's not about being perfect. It's about being committed." Miller leaned back, his hands folded. "Exactly. You're not alone in this. You've got a team, and you've got a mission. The rest will come with time." The conversation left Davis with a renewed sense of clarity. He wasn't alone, and the weight of leadership didn't have to be carried on his shoulders alone either. It was shared by everyone on the team, and as long as he remained focused on what mattered, his people, he would be able to lead them through whatever came next. The next morning, as he addressed his team in the briefing room, Davis felt something he hadn't before. Confidence, not in his own abilities alone, but in the strength of the team he had helped build. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, and they would do it as a unit. Davis knew that his journey had only just begun, but he was no longer the uncertain officer who had once doubted himself. He was a leader now, one who had earned the respect of his peers and, more importantly, his own respect. And with that, he was ready for whatever came next. The days following the mission were filled with a new sense of purpose for Lieutenant Davis. He had proven himself as a capable leader, but now the real challenge began. It wasn't just about being successful in one operation. It was about maintaining that success, about guiding his team through the everyday struggles that came with military life. The pressure was constant, but it didn't weigh him down like it once might have. Instead, Davis found himself rising to meet it. One morning, as the team gathered for their regular briefing, Davis stood at the front of the room, looking at each of them. The faces before him weren't just fellow officers or soldiers. They were his team, the people he was responsible for. And as he looked at them, he knew that his leadership wasn't just about making the right decisions. It was about being there for them, supporting them, and helping them grow. "We've got a lot ahead of us," Davis began, his voice steady. "But I have no doubt that we'll be ready for it. Each of you has proven time and again that you're capable, that you're committed to the mission and to each other. And that's what matters most." There was a quiet confidence in his words, one that wasn't born from arrogance, but from experience. He had learned that being a leader meant more than just issuing orders. It meant being a part of the team, understanding their strengths and weaknesses, and helping them achieve their goals. After the briefing, Davis stepped outside to get some fresh air. He stood on the deck, watching as the sun began to set, casting an orange glow over the base. The quiet was almost peaceful, but it didn't last long. As he turned to walk back inside, he spotted Captain Miller approaching. Miller gave him a small nod of acknowledgement, his expression as calm as ever. "How's the team?" Miller asked. "They're good," Davis replied. "They're ready. I just have to make sure I'm ready for them." Miller studied him for a moment before responding. "You've got this. I've seen what you're capable of. You're not the same officer I first met." Davis smiled, feeling the weight of those words. "Thanks, Captain. I've learned a lot from you." Miller chuckled softly, the sound warm and reassuring. "I didn't teach you everything. You did the rest on your own." Davis nodded, grateful for the support, but also aware that he still had a long way to go. "I know, but it's hard to ignore the examples that have been set before me." Miller's eyes softened. "Just keep leading with that humility, Davis. It's what makes you a good officer, and it's what will make you a great one." As Miller walked away, Davis stood there for a moment, taking in the quiet of the evening. He felt more at peace than he had in a long time. He wasn't just an officer anymore. He was a leader, and he was ready to continue the journey, step by step, with his team by his side. He had learned that leadership wasn't about perfection. It was about progress, about moving forward with the right intentions, and about bringing others along with you. With every decision, every challenge, Davis was becoming the kind of officer he had always hoped to be, and he knew that the road ahead was one he was ready to walk. The weeks turned into months, and Lieutenant Davis continued to grow into the leader he had always hoped to become. The pressure was still there, but now it felt more like a challenge than a burden. He found himself more comfortable in his role, more at ease with the responsibility that had been entrusted to him. It wasn't about proving himself anymore. It was about supporting his team, helping them grow, and leading them through whatever came their way. One evening, as the base settled into a quiet rhythm, Davis found himself sitting alone in his office. The soft glow of the desk lamp illuminated the stack of reports in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about the men and women who made up his team, the faces that had once been unfamiliar, but were now as much a part of him as his own family. They relied on him, and he relied on them. It was a mutual respect, built over months of hard work and shared experiences. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Colonel Harrison standing in the doorway, a slight smile on his face. "Got a minute, Lieutenant?" he asked, his voice calm but filled with purpose. Davis stood up immediately. "Of course, sir. What's on your mind?" The colonel stepped into the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "I've been watching you," he began, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Davis. "I've seen the way you lead, the way you've taken charge of this team. I have to say, I'm impressed." Davis felt a warm sense of pride swell within him. He had always respected Colonel Harrison, and hearing these words from him meant more than he could express. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. "I've learned a lot from my team. They've shown me what it really means to lead." The colonel nodded, a look of approval crossing his face. "That's the right attitude. A leader knows that they don't do it alone. They empower their team, they help them grow, and in turn, they all succeed together." Davis absorbed the words, feeling the weight of them. He had heard similar advice before, but hearing it from the colonel made it hit differently. He understood now that leadership wasn't just about making the right decisions. It was about making the right decisions for the people around you. It was about being the kind of leader who inspired confidence, not by force, but by example. "You've got a good team, Lieutenant," Harrison continued, "and they've got a good leader. Keep it up, and you'll go far." Davis stood taller, the colonel's praise resonating deep within him. "I'll do my best, sir." The colonel smiled and gave a small nod. "I have no doubt about that. Keep leading with the same humility and determination, and you'll be the officer you're meant to be." As the colonel left the office, Davis sat back down at his desk, a new sense of clarity filling his mind. He had earned this respect, but he knew the journey wasn't over. Leadership wasn't a destination. It was a continuous process of learning, growing, and adapting. He wasn't the same officer he had been when he first joined. He had become something more, something better. And as the days passed, Davis continued to lead his team with the quiet strength he had learned from Captain Miller, and the understanding that leadership was about more than just authority. It was about service, commitment, and the ability to guide others to be the best version of themselves. The mission ahead was challenging, but for the first time, Davis felt truly ready to face it, knowing that with his team by his side, there was nothing they couldn't accomplish. As the months continued to unfold, Lieutenant Davis found himself at the forefront of his team, no longer just participating in the missions, but shaping the direction they took. The confidence that had once been a flicker of hope had now become a steady flame that guided his actions. He wasn't just following orders anymore. He was giving them, and his team was responding with trust and respect. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of doubt, moments when he questioned his decisions, but now, those moments didn't stop him. They only pushed him to be better, to learn more, to keep growing. He had come a long way from the brash officer who had once belittled those who had earned their place. Now, he saw himself in them. The veterans who had made sacrifices, who had served with quiet strength, and who had earned the respect of everyone around them without needing to demand it. He had learned the true meaning of leadership, not from books or training, but from the men and women who had shown him what it meant to lead with integrity, humility, and purpose. One morning, as Davis sat in his office reviewing mission reports, he received an unexpected call from Colonel Harrison. "Lieutenant, I need you in my office." The colonel's voice was as calm as ever. Davis immediately stood up, a sense of curiosity settling over him. He hadn't been expecting anything urgent. As he walked into the colonel's office, he was greeted with a smile. "Have a seat, Lieutenant," Harrison said, gesturing toward the chair across from him. "You've been doing an outstanding job, and I think it's time we talk about the future." Davis sat, his mind racing. "What do you mean, sir?" The colonel leaned forward, his hands folded on the desk. "I've been considering your progress, your leadership. You've earned the trust of the men and women under your command, and I believe you're ready for the next step. We've got a new role opening up, one that I think you'll be perfect for." Davis's heart skipped a beat. A new role? He wasn't sure what the colonel meant, but he couldn't deny the excitement that surged through him. "What's the role, sir?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Commanding officer for a new unit," Harrison said, his tone firm but approving. "You'll be leading a special team on some high-priority operations. This is a big responsibility, Lieutenant, but I believe you're ready." Davis's mind raced. He had been working towards something like this, but hearing it out loud made it feel all the more real. He felt the weight of the responsibility, but he also felt a deep sense of pride. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." The colonel nodded. "I know you won't. You've earned this position, Davis. Just remember that leadership is about the team. It's about lifting them up and guiding them through whatever challenges come next. You lead by example, and they'll follow." Davis sat back, the words sinking in. This was the moment he had been working for. He wasn't just taking on a new role. He was stepping into a new chapter of his life, one where he would be the one others looked to for guidance. As he left the colonel's office, Davis felt a sense of clarity that he had never felt before. He wasn't just the officer who had once been uncertain. He was now the leader who would guide his team to success. The road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready for it. He had learned the lessons he needed to lead with integrity, to make the right decisions, and to inspire those around him. And with that, he was ready to take on whatever came next.